one of the things I noticed on one of the slides you showed, Kathy, from the osmosis was one of the pharmacy students said, well, it was not too much detail, but it was just enough to get me the right grade on the test. So as we think about our education and using these tools, I mean, that also goes for thinking about how we are going to evaluate our students and help move to that new platform also. So, Brenda.
Yeah. Hi, Brenda Zieler, University of Washington. And I don't know which person is the best. This is directed at whoever can answer it, but I thought there might be a discussion about crowdsourcing. At the University of Washington, one of our surgeons is using crowdsourcing to assess surgical skills and doing research around that, and it's been very effective.
So I think crowdsourcing plays different roles in different settings, like what you're doing with it. Yochai Benkler has written fairly extensively around the value of crowdsource versus expert-oriented approaches to creating curriculum as an illustration. And clearly it falls on the side of expertise as being a deciding component. That's for creating content specifically that has educational purposes. Crowdsourcing, when you're trying to solve a problem, can be quite effective, depending on the way that you've architected it. There is, and I'm supposed to say this as someone in higher education, but I personally have concerns with the diminishment of the idea of expertise in segments of society, that all opinions are equal and all opinions are valid. It gets one into fascinating political conundrums, for example. And so I think that's something that I do think about, is what happens with, crowdsourcing is valuable, but it also is not a solution to all problems related to knowledge creation.
Any other comments on that, Christoph? Kathy?
The only other comment I would have is I agree that there's certainly a deep expertise in knowledge creation and the content and the learning objectives you're trying to achieve. I would add that there can be the capability for other experts to build on that set of content that gets developed, or assessments, or whatever it might be, so that others, it would not have to be recreated from scratch, but perhaps extended, and learn from the data actually about what works effectively.
It's not on.
Okay. I encountered a quite different form of crowdsourcing in the way in which health professionals were using social media in the context in which I'm working at the moment, and they just solved problems together. Particularly patient-oriented problems. So when they were experiencing a more complex case, they consulted one another, and they also provided emotional support. So in this setting, crowdsourcing works quite well. However, the solution can only be as good as the crowd is, and I found many poor advices in these settings as well, because we were doing content analysis of these conversations. That, okay, is this really the best advice which has been shared in this group? So I think we have to educate the crowd, and then crowdsourcing works probably much better. But it's a very different setting, I have to say as well.
And if I can just address a small point on it, there's a cost factor that arises with crowdsourcing. So when you control the entire cycle of creating knowledge, you have regulatory and quality controls in place. And when you move to a network model, though, your key source of investment is in integrating the nodes. That becomes the most expensive and your greatest vulnerability point in a complex system.
Other questions? Yes.
Kathy, could you talk a little bit about intellectual property as a solution? Looking at it as a solution, how do you overcome that? Because that's an area where a lot of people spend time, they want to maintain that intellectual property, don't want to share it very openly. And also talk about security. Any of you can address security of what you're sharing.
Great, thank you. That's a terrific question. So with respect to intellectual property, it is the creator of whatever the asset, the intellectual content that gets created that automatically gets copyrighted. And if you use an open license, it works within the framework of the law. So it takes the creator to make a choice that they want to share this knowledge with the world. And if they want to share the knowledge with the world, they can use one of 6 Creative Commons licenses. All of the licenses require attribution. So whoever the creator is would get attributed to the creation of their content. And then they can decide whether they want to allow for commercial or non-commercial purposes, or whether they want people to continue to build on it and share it forward. So with respect to the intellectual property, it's really up to the content creator. And if their objective is around knowledge diffusion, reaching many people, it's much easier if you use an open license, because otherwise, if it falls under copyright, you have to go back to the creator and ask for permission to reproduce, to retain, to distribute under the law, and that's how these licenses work. You work within the frameworks of the law. With respect to institutions and academics, what we found is that there are beginning to be some universities who are beginning to acknowledge the power of knowledge diffusion as both part of their mission and what they're trying to incentivize within their institution. So for example, the University of British Columbia actually just changed some of their review processes with respect to tenure, so that those who, individuals who use an open license and who, for example, might create a textbook, know that it gets translated to 20 languages, know that it gets downloaded and reused and repurposed 250,000 times. That kind of information can also be used for their tenure process. So I think we're beginning to see some shifts in norms within academic institutions. I certainly don't think we're anywhere near there. I think the system that's been created is, and particularly for young faculty, they need to publish or perish. That process hasn't changed. And to the extent that we can begin to create more metrics around the distribution of open knowledge and open intellectual property and the impact that it has, then more and more it's beginning to be identified as something that is readily acceptable for the tenure and promotion process. So let me leave it at that and see if others might have comments as well.
Christoph or George, do you have anything to add to that, how your promotion documents at your schools may have changed? I know adding in digital media and using these other things as tools should also eventually make their way into promotion guidelines.
I have a colleague at a university in Canada recently. I was reviewing his tenure and promotion package, and he has very little traditional academic work, not in terms of publications or even in terms of traditional research funding. He was awarded tenure, though, due to the high profile that he brought to the university, his engagement in social media, his engagement in what comes with social media, namely conference keynotes, travel, and so on. So I think universities are aware of that, just like universities have over the last decade plus started to add greater emphasis to teaching practices in their tenure and promotion package as well. So I think there is some changes on it. By the same account, it's as with most innovations, it's an augmentation rather than a replacement.
Are there other? Yes.
This is related, but I'm just wondering about the fiscal side of it. How is it that the institutions over time with open access then protect, I'm not sure that's the right word, but how is it that that institution or those institutions, the learning institutions that all of us are involved with, how is it over time that we look at ways to generate income to pay the faculty?
Do you mean in terms of curriculum? I think curriculum is not an economic value point, the content that we generate in institutions. My general view is if something has a low cost for replication digitally, it shouldn't be an economic value point. Meaning, if I have one digital copy of a video and one person watches it on YouTube or 10,000 people watch it on YouTube, the ease at which it can be duplicated eliminates the opportunity for economic resources to be generated through that. The same holds true with the content and the curriculum that we've developed in our institutions. I firmly believe if taxpayers paid for a resource, it should be free. But we have the fascinating concept. I mean, when you think about it, it's ludicrous. Taxpayers fund our research. We conduct the research with those funds. We publish based on that. We have our peers funded by taxpayers review those resources. Then we give it to a journal. They sell it back to us. It's just, you couldn't devise this stuff if you were certified insane. Like it's fascinating. So that's my view on that. So what are the value points? And this gets back to the earlier question of what does technology do versus what human beings do. I think our curricular practices in classrooms need to change, as I mentioned, much more to exploratory, engaged, dialogue-oriented types of interaction. If a lecture can on how to, let's say, do certain regression models, if that lecture can be done well once and then viewed a million times, it opens terrific opportunities for us to have engaging exploratory implication discussions in classrooms rather than memorizing content discussions. So that's the distinction I'm trying to make, is the relationship between new technologies foster new pedagogies or new approaches to how we learn. And in my eyes, even what MOOCs have taught, initially with open courseware initiatives, MIT was one of the major ones that led, even though it was around prior to that. They taught us that content isn't an economic value point for a university. MOOCs have taught us that teaching remains an economic value point for universities and the related support structures. So that's where I think we should focus on the revenue side of the house, with a caveat that a good majority of higher education globally doesn't face the same economic models that United States and UK, for example, utilize.
Catherine, do you have any?
Yeah, the other comment I'd like to add is that whether it's a higher ed institution or other institutions, those who tend to be sharing the content openly have an value-added service around it, just as George was describing with respect to higher education. So Osmosis, as an example, is a nonprofit, but how it funds the ability to make these videos and make them freely available is it has a flashcard distribution system. So students who are studying, you quote one of the students' testimonies, can register for online flashcards with respect to some of the exams that they need to take. And they have a content deck that is essentially sent to your phone. It's readily available and helps the students succeed and serve up the content in a way. So they create some interesting value-added services around content itself, and I completely agree with George, content is everywhere. And so the unique value proposition of higher education is really people getting together like you're all able to do today in the room. We could have all gotten together by computer, but we're not robots. And so there's a value to the transactions that happen when we're together face to face. And that's where a lot of the synergies happen. So there's a new immersion of business models as well as we enter this digital age where there is content in many places. And then just the last point with respect to kind of building on what George described, some of the work in open educational resources has been focused on textbooks because it's been a way to create an affordable asset for students who otherwise are burdened. Particularly in this country, over half of students go to higher education, go to community colleges, and in California, they pay more for the textbooks than they pay for the tuition fees. California itself has now actually allocated state money, so when there's some textbooks in the high course areas, high enrollment courses that are actually licensed under Creative Commons. And so it does not have to be created again and again. And kind of with regard to the ludicrousness of the system, when we build in this country roads, the contractor who builds the road does not own the road. We, the public, own the road, and we can all pass on the road. But yet, with respect to educational assets, we have other people create them. They own the IP, even though we've paid for them, and we have to pay for them time and again. And now we have a way to create greater efficiencies as we move forward.
Great, thank you. Are there other questions for the panel? Yeah, oh, Christoph. Yes.
Perhaps just one concept which quite fits well in this debate is the flipped classroom, right? So what we really have to think, what kind of added value can we still provide to our students, and what can technology do to support us in the process, right? And I think the value is really that we can have personalized learning in the classroom. Students can watch the videos, they can read the books before, and then when it comes to classroom training, then we as tutors, as facilitators, as lecturers, we have to engage them and we have to really facilitate personalized learning process. And I think this is making our education better. And this is actually the way that we have to think of whenever we are using technology, what's the added value and what can we do better?
Sure, Patricia.
So I mean, I agree with what you're saying. I'm thinking about our conversation, I think it was 2 sessions ago, looking at the financing in higher education and how the person from the World Bank really questioned in the United States that we're using research dollars to support the education side of, in the United States. And so what it seems to me that we're really talking about is a rethinking of how we look at the financing in higher education in many different ways. And then the other question is, how then do we, because we're all in practice professions, how do we then translate this into the clinical site to make sure that we have competency?
I think the opportunities around that is, again, this idea, if you require more input costs, you have an economic point, meaning if you create one of something without additional dollars in, you can't make money on it. If you have a student that comes into a clinical setting and you have supervision and feedback and guidance, and if you bring a second student in, you have mentorship and teaching and guidance, you now have an economic value point, something that'll generate resources to the institution or to the individual. At some level, though, it's worth looking at what's happened in other fields. I mean, we're going to see similar challenges to, let's say, what broadcast companies or cable companies or others have experienced with the arrival of Netflix and Amazon Prime and others. I can, for $8, $9, $10, $12, or even $20 if I go with Hulu and Netflix, and I can access millions of hours of video. That's a subscription model, and I think universities are going to have to start reckoning with alternative relationship models with students, because right now we think our relationship with a student needs to net us, $20,000 a year for 4 years, so we want $80,000 out of that student. Let's say we settle on $150,000, but we split that over 40 years. So what's the annual cost of access to education? All you can learn buffet for X number of dollars a year. All bets are off in terms of what the future will look like economically for higher education. Like, everything is a viable consideration at this stage.
I think we had a question at table 6, and then 1, and then 4.
Sure. So it's a follow-up to earlier conversation. In fact, it's a continuation of this thread now, either for George or Kathy. From the point, it's heartening that the academic institutions will pay more attention to teaching activities now, as opposed to not funding them at all. However, unless a business model is created to monetize the teaching activities, online activities, otherwise, or innovations, my fear is that the academic institutions will continue to give, I would say, very unusual preference to the research side, because you get indirect costs, right? So you get funded through NIH, for example, but then you get indirect costs, which pays for all of the infrastructure and the professor's salary. Are there efforts, do you think there are business models out there which could monetize some of these innovations in terms of learning and teaching? Or is it too much to ask for at this time? The bottom line is, unless we do something similar there, teachers would be, again, the stepchildren.
Yeah, I might make a comment, George, and then you can follow up. I do want to reiterate that over half of the students in this country go to community colleges. Many go to state and regional schools. Very few go to the elite Ivy four-year colleges. Less than 20% live in residential programs on campus. So I'm sure those of us in the room, those of us who have graduate degrees, doctorates, our experiences are different from the bulk of higher education in this country. So I just wanted to pinpoint that one comment. We always talk about higher education as if we're all going to Harvard and Stanford and Princeton and University of Wisconsin, some of the big systems, but we're not. And so I do just want to highlight that. I think that alone is a differentiator, because those schools have been focused on teaching. They do not have the research dollars. They have tried to scale in lots of interesting ways. I do think that you need to kind of disaggregate and differentiate the different aspects of higher ed. You know, some of the elite schools, some of the big schools, they offer an experience which is around networking, which is around the Socrates process in the classroom of discovery and learning. That is not happening in a lot of schools of higher education in this country. So I think as you think about economic models for the future, I think we're thinking about how they serve students differently and how they will likely serve students differently. It's a privilege to be able to go to a four-year university and as a young adult grow up in a safe and relatively protected campus environment. But many students in the higher education are actually working full-time. They're older adults. They might have some college, no degree. These are the individuals who often actually are engaging in some of the health professionals and nursing and other areas as well. So I do think the model is going to be differentiated for different aspects of the community. I think what we know is everyone is going to be a lifelong learner, is no longer 12 plus 4 plus maybe 2. People are going to be dipping in and out of education in their whole life process. We are not going to be able to finish and say we're done after we achieve a BA because the world is changing too fast and the skills we need will continue to change. So I think you'll see a much more flexible, permeable system going forward. And I think it's up to the higher education system to see how those typically rather rigid boundaries become more permeable and allow students to oscillate back and forth. Whether they're on the job, where they need some experiences, where they might have an internship. I think the path forward will look different for the learner in 5 to 10 years. We're beginning to see it in some sectors. And, you know, for some where there's deep expertise, it may not change. But I think, again, we're going to have a strong reflection on that.
Great. Over here at table 1.
Thank you for the great presentation. I'm just looking at digital learning and the barriers to adoption. And George, you had a slide where it looked like there was more embracement, 42%, I think it was escalating by the faculty and accepting. And so I know in early times, early adopters were picking that up. Now are we in the mid-adopter era? And what continue to be the barriers? Because many times I know they say there's lack of evidence, that online's less high quality than face-to-face. I know we've abolished that by the evidence. But what are you seeing? It just that doesn't have to be George, any of you, some of those barriers, and are we in the mid-adopter range? And where are we going from here?
So there's this, I'll introduce this idea of sort of an alpha trend. An alpha trend is one that shapes everything. And quite honestly, we would be doing digital learning even if the evidence suggested that it wasn't as good as in classroom learning, which isn't the issue. But the reason we would be doing it because that's the way society goes. And that's an alpha trend. You can like it or hate it, but you're on the train, and if you get off, it'll hurt. And so that's, I think, something to be aware of with these trends. So even now, people who say 42% teach online, even those faculty members likely have a syllabus in a learning management system. Those faculty members over the next few years will likely be working with data or analytics that have been produced by SAS or by Tableau or by a company like Civitas that targets the educational sector. So I think the barriers that I see right now are, it's almost exclusively vision. The pieces are all here. We have this thing in front of us that we can configure into fascinating new approaches to improve access, reduce some of the equity barriers, in some cases even reduce some of the costs. The pieces are all there. Leadership has largely failed higher education institutions, and that's not just in the U.S. I mean, that's a global thing. We've had very ineffective leadership. There's instances where you have a dean that'll drive and make big change within an institution, but by and large, we don't have the vision that stitches the pieces together that gives us something that we can hang on to and collaboratively work toward. Systems that have done that have yielded significant benefits. Obviously, ASU is a common one with Michael Crow's work that gets cited frequently, but there's not really that many of those kinds of illustrations out there. Other barriers, though, which are secondary to that primary barrier, are faculty skill sets. There needs to be instructional activity to get faculty up to speed to interact in this environment. Their students are learning in digital ways, whether they appreciate it or not, but that needs to be an issue. There is a lack of digital pedagogical models that we look at. Even some some of the conversations that we're having here about, is it this university or that university? We're treating our ideas like they're binary, but they're not. Ideas are networked, which means you don't want to normalize the differences that exist between the systems. You want to say, we need a top system that's research-oriented. We need R1s, but we also need community colleges. That's a mindset shift for all of us to stop thinking in binaries and start thinking in networks, not just around the digital learning, but just the structure of our society that we're facing today. The resource one is a significant barrier as well. You can't go from teaching in classroom to suddenly magically teaching online without an investment of resources. And that means you have to look at how are you going to teach the content, you have to have learning designers, media individuals, and so on. In this regard, we see a number of groups that are called OPMs that come in now, 2U, Academic Partnerships, Pearson Learning, and others that have stepped up that said, hey, we can move your entire master's degree online. We'll only need about 50 to 60% of your tuition, though. And universities sign on for that because of lack of leadership. And so those are the kinds of challenges that I think we face. Some systemic, but when you get down to it, there are granular skill levels on part of faculty and the resource allocation to move to digital environments and teaching.
We had a couple questions in the queue, so I think we'll go table 4 and then table 3.
Hi, George Tebow, Macy Foundation. This has been a fantastic discussion. And I want to raise an issue about faculty development. So when we think of faculty development in this domain, we often think about teaching the faculty about the technology and how to use it, how to convert a lecture into a meaningful online course. But I think the biggest and most exciting element of faculty development is to say, what do you do with your faculty if they're no longer transmitting knowledge? And how do you have faculty who really know how to do true assessment, how to assess the comprehension of the learner, and how to involve in communication and application? That, to me, is the biggest challenge and excitement of what are our faculty going to do in the future, and how are we going to prepare them for that?
Fully agree. I'll give you a quick illustration. So in early 2000, I was able to get on the conference keynote circuit, and I spent a lot of time traveling, and my conferences consisted of go blogs, go wikis, and people would say, ooh, blogs and wikis, what are they? Because they hadn't heard of them. Now in a digital environment, you can't do that. You can't introduce people to ideas and expect to make an impact. And so what I mean is we're all connected. We get pings and notifications, and colleagues and the Chronicle and Inside Higher Ed and other systems, EdSearch, push information to us regularly. So this idea of knowing things cannot make us unique and valuable anymore. Processing what that stuff means, that's what's lacking, making sense of it. We don't need another report that tells us about something. We need wisdom, if I can use that term. We need insight, we need sense-making and wayfinding capabilities. That's the big gap in the information space right now. We actually have a deluge of stuff. Anybody here, if I was to say, hey, what are trends? And you'd all be able to pick out and say, oh yeah, there's this with analytics going on, and there's algorithmic accountability, and there's AI models that concern us. There's micro-credentialing, there's new approaches to assessing and validating students with blockchain approaches. We'd be able to have a great conversation. But if we were to say, now stitch that together and tell me what it means, then it would be like, oh shit, that's tough. So I'm trying to get to those conversations rather than the, hey, what do we all know? I'm trying to get to, hey, what does this all mean aspect? And that's the heavy investment that you're trying to address as well, I think.
I spend a lot of my time every day thinking about what are we going to do with faculty, and I think that I've used videos that say, kind of what George said this morning, that the human values are really what's going to be valued, and so that teaching the critical thinking and the problem solving are where our dollars are going to matter, the student tuition dollars. We have one more question, but Catherine or Christoph, did you have any comments to that question?
I was just going to add that there's a great example of this. So I think the technology actually frees faculty and teachers up to do what they do best. Instead of being a sage on the stage, they're a guide on the side who can help every individual in their personal learning journey who's in that classroom. And as one example, one of the projects that we funded early from the Hewlett Foundation, Open Educational Resources, was Carnegie Mellon's Open Learning Initiative. And there was a faculty member who was almost a provost who taught a class a number of times, and he created the online version. And there was actually a random assignment of the course online vis-a-vis face-to-face. And there was one aspect of the course he loved to teach, which was truth tables. And he could not believe that it could possibly be taught better online than it could with him on the stage. Because he loved to teach it. That was what he as a faculty member had done. But yet with the scaffolding that they had been able to embed into the open learning course when students get stuck and whatever the hint might be needed, and my pathway might be different from George because George has different prior knowledge, the students' learning outcomes were twice as high and twice as successful in half the time than the students with the faculty on the stage. So when we think about business models and economies, there's ways to actually engage students differently with respect to time, with respect to courses, that we haven't yet necessarily conceptualized. And we're still on an agrarian calendar for the most part. 18 weeks may not be the right semester length. These are all things that can be recalculated and rethought as we move ahead.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one last question. Oh, it just got answered. Is there one last question? Well, I think any last comments from the speakers? Final words?
Oh, thank you.
So I think as we think about going to our break, over the rest of the day, there is a lot more. And to engage in, to think about how some of the questions you've just asked now will be used later in the day through that knowledge that you gain and as you network some more. And Pam, you have something before we go?
Just real quick. Thank you. Can we give Ruth and our guest speakers a hand, please?